When I was 57, my only son sold my house right out from under me, packed up his wife, and moved 2 states away. They left me exactly $150 and a note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "You will figure it out." 15 years on, my grandson ran my name through Google for a school project and rang me up sobbing. Inside 12 hours, 200 missed calls had stacked up on my phone, every last one, from the son who'd discarded me like I was nothing. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where quiet men finish what the loud ones started. If these stories of dignity, patience, and hard-earned justice speak to something in you, I'd be glad if you'd like and subscribe so you never miss one. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me, is it at morning, where you are afternoon, or are you up late letting this story settle in? I always like knowing who's listening. One quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the audio format, and any resemblance to real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth running underneath it. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not let up since noon. I lifted the device, the cold metal pressing against my calloused hands, hands that had labored without rest for decades to construct a life my own flesh and blood had once stolen from me. I swiped the screen and answered, holding the receiver to my ear without making a sound. Ragged, uneven breathing filled the speaker. Then a voice split the silence, young, shaking, strangled by tears. "Grandpa." That single word landed like a fist to the chest. It was Cody. The last time I'd laid eyes on my grandson, he was a 7-year-old boy digging in the dirt out back, completely blind to the monstrous betrayal his parents were engineering inside the house. I held my tongue, allowing the crushing weight of 15 years of absence to settle between us. "Grandpa, please don't hang up," Cody begged, his voice fracturing. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know anything." I was writing a research paper for my university business class today. My professor had us profile leading philanthropists in the biotech industry. I typed your name into the search bar just to find out if you were even still alive. The Bloomberg feature article came up. The biotech billionaire who gives away half his fortune to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that actually you? I shut my eyes and exhale, slow, deliberate. The silence of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt sealed off entirely from the eruption on the other end of the line. "Yes, Cody," I said at last, my voice level, carrying the full weight of a 72-year-old man who had clawed back from total ruin. "It is me." A harsh sob tore out of the young man's throat. Cody was 22 now, but right then he sounded like a child who'd gotten lost and couldn't find his way home. "They told me you abandoned us." He wept, the words spilling out in a frantic rush. "Mom and Dad said you ran off with some woman, that you drained all the family money and left us with absolutely nothing. But the article said you built your company from the ground up 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I didn't raise my voice. I had no need to. True power doesn't require shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Cody," I answered evenly. "They chose to strip away everything I had, and they chose to feed you lies about it. I rebuilt my life from the rubble they left behind. I didn't run. I outlasted them." I could hear Cody weeping, the shattering truth about his parents' character bearing down on him all at once. But before another question could form, the audio on his end lurched and muffled. A sudden violent commotion, a door crashing open, a sharp startled gasp from Cody. "Give me that phone." A hard commanding voice cut through from somewhere in the background. I could hear Renata calling out, telling him to put it on speaker. A brief struggle followed the scrape of plastic against skin, and then the line dropped for a half-second before a new voice came through. It was Garrett, my son. The man who had met my eyes 15 years ago smiled and quietly sold the roof from over my head. "Dad," Garrett's voice was frantic, breathless, but underneath the staged panic, that familiar nauseating undertone of naked greed rang through unmistakably. "Dad, is that really you? Oh my God, we've been searching for you everywhere. For 15 years, we've been trying to track you down." My grip on the phone tightened, but my pulse didn't climb. No fear, no sudden swell of fatherly warmth. Only a cold, clear-eyed calm. The son who had discarded me like a broken tool was now desperate to reconnect. Not because he'd missed his father, but because he'd just learned his father was worth billions. "Dad, please say something," Garrett implored, his voice slathered in syrupy desperation. "My company is in serious trouble. We're staring down a massive crisis. And when Cody showed us that article, I couldn't believe it. You have to tell me where you are. We're family, Dad. You have to save us. I listened to his ragged breathing, picturing the panic and raw avarice twisting across his face. He was waiting for a lifeline, waiting for the forgiving, gullible father he'd discarded 15 years ago to come charging to the rescue. But that man was gone. They had buried him the day they pressed a crumpled $150 into his hands. I pulled the phone from my ear, held my thumb over the glowing red icon, and pressed it. The call ended with a clean, decisive click. I set the phone down on the polished walnut desk and let the room sink back into total, unbroken quiet. The first move had been his. The next one would be mine. Picture arriving home from your wife's funeral to find the locks swapped out, your belongings cleared away, and a crumpled 150 on the porch with a note from your only son that read, "You will figure it out." I did figure it out. For 15 years, they assumed I'd crawled into a corner somewhere to fade and die. But then my 22-year-old grandson punched my name into a search engine for a college paper and uncovered a billion-dollar secret. Within 12 hours, my phone was buried under 200 missed calls from the very people who'd thrown me out like rubbish. The screen of my smartphone lit up the pitch-black stillness of my private study, throwing a cold, pale wash across the polished walnut desk. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline burned and glittered like flung diamonds, a sharp counterpoint to the dark tide of memories rising in my mind. My phone was buzzing again, a relentless hammering vibration, threatening to shake itself right off the table's edge. I settled back into my wingback chair, perfectly still, watching the notifications accumulate. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not let up since noon. I picked up the phone, the cold metal biting into my calloused hands that had worked without pause for decades to raise up a life my own flesh and blood had once plundered from me. I swiped the screen and answered, bringing it to my ear without saying a word. Ragged, uneven breathing poured through the speaker. Then a voice cracked the silence, young, trembling, soaked in tears. "Grandpa." It struck me like a blow to the ribs. It was Cody. The last time I'd seen my grandson, he was a 7-year-old tracking through the dirt of my backyard, entirely unaware of the monstrous betrayal his parents were plotting just inside. I stayed quiet, letting the full, suffocating weight of 15 years of absence fall between us. "Grandpa, please don't hang up," Cody pleaded, his voice dissolving into a sob. "I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know anything. I was writing a research paper for my university business class today. My professor assigned us to profile top philanthropists in the biotech industry. I typed your name into the search bar just to see if maybe somehow you were still out there." The Bloomberg feature article came up. The biotech billionaire who donates half his wealth to senior housing initiatives. "Grandpa, is that really you?" I closed my eyes and let out a slow, measured breath. The stillness of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt completely walled off from the chaos unraveling on the other end of the line. "Yes, Cody," I said, finally voice steady, carrying the weight of a 72-year-old man who had endured absolute ruin. "It is me." A harsh sob ripped from the young man's throat. Cody was 22 now, but in that moment, he sounded like a lost, broken child. "They told me you abandoned us," he cried, words pouring out in a desperate, stumbling flood. "Mom and Dad told me you ran off with some woman, that you took all the family money and left us with absolutely nothing. But the article said you built your company from scratch 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. True power does not require shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Cody," I replied calmly. "They made a choice to take everything I had, and they made a choice to lie to you about it. I built my life back from the ashes they left me in. I did not run away. I survived them." I could hear Cody crying, the devastating truth of his parents' nature crashing over him. But before he could press further, the audio on his end lurched violently. A sudden chaotic scramble, a door slamming open, a sharp gasp from Cody. "Give me that phone." A hard, demanding voice barked from somewhere off to the side. I could hear Renata shouting in the distance, telling him to put it on speaker. A brief struggle, the scrape of plastic against skin, and then the line went silent for a fraction of a second before a new voice came through the receiver. It was Garrett, my son. The man who had looked me square in the eye 15 years ago, smiled, and quietly sold the roof over my head. "Dad!" Garrett's voice was frantic, breathless, but beneath all the manufactured panic, the unmistakable, sickening pitch of pure greed leaked through. Dad, is that really you? Oh my God, we have been looking for you everywhere. For 15 years, we have been trying to track you down. My grip on the phone tightened, but my pulse didn't climb. No fear, no sudden swell of fatherly warmth. Only a cold, clear-eyed calm. The son who had discarded me like a broken tool was now desperate to reconnect. Not because he'd missed his father, but because he'd just learned his father was worth billions. Dad, please say something, Garrett implored, his voice slathered in a cloying, rehearsed desperation. My company is in trouble. We're staring down a massive financial crisis. And when Cody showed us that article, I couldn't believe it. You have to tell me where you are. We're family, Dad. You have to save us. I listened to his ragged breathing, picturing the panic and raw avarice twisting across his face. He was waiting for a lifeline, waiting for the forgiving, gullible father he'd left behind 15 years ago to come charging in and pull him out. He actually believed that time and bloodline would wipe away the memory of standing alone in an empty driveway clutching a pathetic wad of cash while the moving truck disappeared around the corner. But that man was dead. They had buried him the day they pressed a crumpled $150 into his hands and told him to figure it out. Now Garrett wanted me to rescue his crumbling real estate venture. He wanted the billionaire philanthropist, not the father. I pulled the phone from my ear, held my thumb over the glowing red icon, and pressed it. The call ended with a clean, decisive click. I set the phone down on the polished walnut desk and let the room fall back into total, unbroken silence. The first move had been his. The next one would be mine. The heavy mahogany doors of the private boardroom swung shut with a firm click, sealing us in. Garrett didn't bother with pleasantries or hollow apologies. He crossed straight to the long glass table and flung a thick laminated portfolio across its surface. It skimmed the glass and came to rest directly in front of me. I looked at the portfolio, then up at the man who used to be my son. He wore a tailored suit that did its best to conceal the desperate sweat already forming on his brow. He pressed both hands flat on the table and leaned in, demanding a $2 million loan to prop up his collapsing real estate development firm. He rattled off terms like liquidity crisis and temporary market downturns, working hard to project the image of a sharp businessman at the negotiating table. But the panic in his eyes gave everything away. He was going under, and he expected me to be the thing that kept him afloat. I settled back in my wingback chair, hands resting still in my lap, and let him talk. I didn't cut in. I simply watched the breathtaking audacity of it play out in front of me. Then Renata joined in. She was seated beside him in an expensive silk dress paid for with someone else's money, crossing her legs with a polished, practiced elegance that turned my stomach. She leaned forward, her voice coated first in syrupy sweetness that quickly sharpened into accusation. She looked me directly in the eye and said that while the loan was the priority, there was something else we needed to address, Cody. She had the nerve to tell me that growing up without a grandfather had been deeply damaging to my grandson. My sudden disappearance 15 years ago, according to her rewritten version of events, had carved a lasting psychological wound in Cody's life. In her telling, I was the one who had walked away. She sat there in my room and demanded I immediately establish a substantial trust fund for Cody compensation, she called it, for the childhood I had supposedly robbed him of. The sheer shamelessness of it hung in the air like a bad smell. These were the two people who had maneuvered me into signing over my power of attorney, while grief had hollowed me out completely after my wife's death. These were the people who had liquidated my home, loaded up their things, and vanished across state lines, leaving me with a single crumpled $100 bill of $50 and a note that said to figure it out. And now here they sat, rewriting the whole story, casting themselves as the abandoned victims of a negligent father. I didn't scream. I didn't hurl the portfolio back in their faces. The fury inside me wasn't a fire. It was a glacier cold, slow and utterly unstoppable. I studied the $2 million proposal, then looked at Renata, then at Garrett. I let the silence stretch 10, maybe 15 seconds. I furrowed my brow slightly and exhaled, playing the part of a tired, guilty old man, genuinely wrestling with the burden of his past and mulling over their demands. That hesitation was a test, and Garrett failed it without a moment's delay. Patience had never been in his character. The suit and the desperation had stripped away whatever thin veneer of composure he'd managed to hold on to. He drove his fist down onto the glass table. The sharp crack rang out through the room. His face darkened to an ugly mottled red, and the mask of the desperate but reasonable businessman shattered completely. He jabbed a trembling finger in my direction, his voice climbing to a raw, entitled shout. He told me to stop playing games. He said I was 72 years old, with absolutely no use for billions of dollars. He said I was an old man sitting alone in a penthouse while his real family was out there fighting to survive. He leaned close enough that I could see the pulse hammering in his neck, and he spat out the words that sealed his fate for good. He told me I owed them this money. He said I owed them for vanishing all those years ago and leaving them to fend for themselves. That was the moment, the final drop that made the glass overflow. He actually believed his own lies. He believed that, because I'd stayed silent for 15 years, I was weak. He mistook my quiet observation for surrender. I looked at his flushed, furious face and no longer saw my son. I saw a parasite that had finally exhausted every host it had. I kept my expression blank, holding the lethal trap I was about to spring perfectly in place. The atmosphere inside the private boardroom was thick enough to suffocate. Garrett was still planted over that massive glass table face, burning with a toxic blend of entitlement and panic, waiting for me to simply hand over $2 million and save his sinking operation. Before I could deliver my answer, the heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom burst open with a violent crash. They struck the wall so hard the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Standing in the doorway, chest-heaving eyes lit with frantic desperation, was Cody. He looked as though he'd sprinted the whole way from his university campus. His heavy backpack slipped from his shoulder and hit the carpet with a dull thud. He didn't even glance at me. His tear-filled gaze locked hard onto his parents. "Cody, what are you doing here?" Garrett snapped. His voice dropped a register, attempting to smother his naked desperation beneath a layer of parental authority. Renata rose, immediately smoothing down her silk dress, her manufactured smile wavering as she stretched a hand toward him. Cody ignored it. He moved further into the room, his breathing ragged and uneven. "You lied to me," he said, voice shaking but gaining force with every word. "My entire life you told me he abandoned us. You told me he ran off with some mistress and drained every account we had." Renata's face went white. She flicked a nervous look at me, then back at her son. "Sweetheart, please, we can sort this out at home. This is not the moment for this. Your father and I are in the middle of something very important. Business." Cody let out a short, hollow laugh, raw with heartbreak. "You're in here begging him for money. The man you said was a selfish coward. The man you told me left us to starve. I read the articles on the way over here. I looked at the dates. He lost everything the exact same month we moved into that big house in the suburbs. You stole from him. You took everything he had." The air drained out of the room all at once. Garrett's face twisted into something ugly and cornered. Every layer of the struggling but respectable real estate developer evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a trapped, vicious animal. "Shut your mouth!" Garrett roared. He closed the gap between himself and his son in 2 hard strides and raised his hand. The slap was deafening. The sharp, violent crack of it rang off the high ceiling of the boardroom. Cody stumbled back, his hand flying to his rapidly reddening cheek eyes, wide with shock and betrayal. Renata gasped, but she didn't move a single step toward her son. She just stood there frozen as her own lies caved in around her. I didn't think, I just moved. At 72 years old, you'd expect my reflexes to have slowed, but the protective instinct of a grandfather answers to no age. Before Garrett could raise his hand a second time, I drove myself between them. I shoved Garrett back with a force that caught us both off guard, sending him stumbling into the sharp corner of the glass table. "Don't you ever put your hands on him again," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. The room went dead silent. Garrett looked at me, rubbing his chest where I'd pushed him, breathing hard, eyes darting in all directions. "You have no right to interfere," he spat, stabbing a shaking finger toward me. "He is my son. You don't get to walk back into our lives after 15 years and tell me how to handle my own child." I held my ground, keeping Cody sheltered behind my shoulder. I could feel the young man tremble, but he didn't pull away. I looked at the man I had raised. In that precise moment, the last remaining trace of paternal patience drained out of me completely. The hesitant, guilt-ridden old man they believed they were manipulating had ceased to exist. In his place stood someone who had clawed back from total ruin and built a billion-dollar empire out of nothing. I regarded Garrett not with rage, but with a chilling surgical clarity. The season of watching was finished. The trap was ready to spring. I straightened the cuffs of my suit jacket, a deliberate, unhurried gesture that shattered the tension with an almost terrifying composure. I drew a slow breath and moved my gaze from Garrett's flushed face to Renata's pale, calculating eyes. "You are absolutely right," I said, letting the words settle like a stone dropping into still water. I owe you. I owe you both precisely what you deserve for these past 15 years. Garrett's hand slowly lowered. His breathing steadied as the word "oh" lit up the parasitic greed hardwired into him. His fury was instantly overridden by his craving for my money. I walked back to my wingback chair unhurried and composed and regarded them both. Tomorrow evening my foundation is hosting our annual charity gala downtown. I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who holds every card. Every major investor, media outlet, and industry leader will be in that room. It's the largest event of the year for my company. I want you both there, dress well, be on time. Cody will attend as my personal guest. Garrett exchanged a swift calculating glance with Renata. He swallowed his earlier fury, dissolving entirely into hungry anticipation. "And the loan?" he asked, his voice barely steadied by renewed hope. "The $2 million. I met his eager, hollow stare and gave him a slow, measured nod. "Tomorrow night, I'll take the stage," I said, "and in front of everyone present I will officially announce my decision regarding my successor and the future of my entire fortune. Be there and you will get exactly what is coming to you." Garrett's eyes ignited with a blinding, toxic ambition. A smug, satisfied smile crept across Renata's face. They genuinely believed they had won. They'd swallowed the bait whole hook, line, and sinker, completely blind to the fact that they were walking straight into their own ruin. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, absorbing the frantic, grasping energy Garrett had dragged into the room. I was alone. The silence of the penthouse boardroom returned thick, absolute, a stark counterpoint to the family explosion that had just played out within those walls. I didn't sink into my wingback chair. I didn't press my fingers to my temples or grieve the wreckage of my relationship with my son. That grief had been buried 15 years ago. Now there was only the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had just invited a parasite to a feast. I reached for the intercom on my desk and pressed the button. "Send Conrad in," I said. My voice was level, all residual feeling stripped from it. Within 60 seconds, the doors opened. Conrad, my chief legal counsel and head of corporate intelligence, entered the room. He moved with quiet, efficient purpose, his face a perfect mask of professional detachment. He carried a thick canvas briefcase which he set carefully on the glass table, right over the spot where Garrett had slammed his fist minutes earlier. "You asked me to dig into his company," Conrad said, snapping the briefcase open. "I didn't just dig Clifford. I brought out the heavy machinery." He drew out a thick stack of confidential financial records, bank statements, and court filings and spread them across the table. I looked at the spread of documents. Garrett believed he could stroll into my office, toss around a few industry buzzwords, and blind me with a fabricated story about a temporary liquidity crisis. He and his wife actually thought the man who had built a global biotechnology empire from absolute zero would hand over $2 million without running a forensic background check. Conrad pressed a manicured finger to a spreadsheet highlighted in vivid red. "Your son isn't simply riding out a market downturn," he said, his tone perfectly flat. "He's broke, and frankly, broke would be a significant improvement on his actual position. Garrett is submerged in catastrophic criminal debt." I leaned forward, eyes moving across the heavily marked documents. "For the past 3 years," Conrad continued, "Garrett has been operating his real estate firm like a personal account. He's been systematically siphoning money from his active residential projects to bankroll a lavish lifestyle designer, clothes, luxury cars, expensive holidays, all funded by money that was never his. He built a network of fraudulent vendor invoices to conceal the trail, but he grew careless. And that isn't even the worst of it," Conrad said, lifting a secondary file from the canvas briefcase. It bore a federal seal along the top margin. 2 months ago, a group of private investors noticed the inconsistencies buried in his quarterly reports. They brought in a forensic accounting firm. The auditors found a gaping black hole at the center of his corporate accounts. Garrett has embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He is currently the subject of an active covert investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The pieces locked together with crystalline clarity. The frantic calls, the sudden desperate need to resurface after 15 years of silence, the aggressive push for exactly $2 million. Garrett didn't want my money to develop new properties. He needed a large immediate injection of untraceable cash to quietly patch the hole in his accounts before federal agents came through his door. He was terrified, cornered, and hunting for a lifeline. He thought he could use the father he had discarded as a buffer against a federal indictment. A low, humorless laugh escaped me. It was a pathetic, almost magnificent kind of arrogance. He had thrown me into the street with $150, confident I would simply fold and disappear. Now, staring down decades in a federal penitentiary, he expected me to blindly hand over $2 million to rescue him from his own greed. He truly believed I was still that same broken, grieving man from 15 years ago. Conrad gathered the documents, stacking them tidily back into the canvas briefcase. He looked at me, expression grave. "We have undeniable proof of his crimes, Clifford," he said quietly. "The wire transfers, the shell companies, the forged signatures. All of it is here. Do you want me to contact the authorities now? We can hand this entire portfolio over to the federal investigators and have him taken in before he even makes it home." I rose from my chair and crossed slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below was coming alive, a vast sprawling grid of gold and silver, bleeding out toward the horizon. I looked down at those streets and thought about the charity gala unfolding tomorrow night. I thought about Garrett racing home to tell Renata they had successfully played the old man, that their salvation was locked in. I wanted him to savor that. I wanted him to taste the victory fully. I wanted him to sleep well tonight, dreaming of billions. I turned back to Conrad, my face a mask of absolute unforgiving cold. "No," I said, smooth and unhurried. "Don't call the police. Let him put on his finest suit. Let him walk the red carpet. Let him step up to the podium and feel the weight of that golden crown settling on his head. Because a fall from the bottom step is forgotten by mourning Conrad. I want him to fall from the very top. Only when he believes he's won everything will we knock him off the edge." The bell above the door of the small corner cafe chimed softly over the low murmur of the espresso machine. I was tucked into a booth near the back, nursing a black tea, watching the entrance. Cody walked in. He looked completely hollowed out. The dark circles beneath his eyes and the defeated slope of his shoulders told the story plainly, a young man whose entire world was coming apart at the seams. He spotted me and threaded his way through the narrow rows of wooden tables. He dropped into the booth across from me and fixed his gaze on the scarred surface of the tabletop. I didn't offer a warm smile or reach over to squeeze his shoulder. This wasn't a reunion. This was an intervention. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and drew out a small silver flash drive. I set it squarely on the table between us. The metal clicked against the wood, pulling his eyes down to it. I told him that everything contained on that drive was the unvarnished truth about the people who had raised him. I laid it out plainly. Garrett wasn't weathering a routine market correction. He had embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He had falsified records, constructed fictitious vendor accounts, and funneled stolen money into a life of pure excess. Cody's parents weren't seeking a family reconciliation. They were hunting for a human shield to place between themselves and a federal indictment. Cody stared at the drive as though it might bite him. His breathing went shallow. He asked how they could be so reckless, how lying could come so easily to them. I looked at my grandson and told him that lying was the simplest thing his parents had ever done. I asked him to picture a 57-year-old man returning from a cemetery. I had just buried my wife, his grandmother. The house was supposed to be a place of mourning, of quiet, of comfort. Instead, I walked up to the front porch and found the door locked tight. My key wouldn't turn. I peered through the front window. The living room was gutted. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every trace of a life lived together had been cleared out. I kept my voice remarkably steady as I described the breathless, disorienting panic of that afternoon. I told him about the single envelope on the doormat. Inside, exactly $150 in crumpled bills and a handwritten note from his father. It said to figure it out. They had preyed on my grief at its deepest point. They had manipulated me into signing away my assets while my mind was dulled by sorrow and heavy medication. They took my home, my savings, my only grandson, and drove away across state lines without a backward glance. A heavy, suffocating quiet settled over the booth. Cody buried his face in his hands. His shoulders heaved as he fought to hold back the sobs. The full weight of the truth was dismantling him. The life of comfort he had known, the family he had looked up to it, was all constructed on the wreckage of an old man they had left for dead. He whispered that they were monsters. He kept saying it, voice splintering with revulsion and grief. I didn't argue with him. I let him cry. I let the agony of the betrayal incinerate whatever illusions he still clung to. It's a brutal thing to watch a young man lose his parents while they're still breathing, but a surgeon doesn't hesitate when the tissue is infected. It simply had to come out. I waited until his breathing evened out. When he finally wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, I leaned in, forearms resting on the table, and nudged the flash drive a few inches closer to him. I told him that the following night, the whole city would have its eyes on the charity gala. I told him his parents would be seated in the front row, dressed in clothes purchased on my stolen credit line, waiting to be anointed heirs to my empire. Then I gave him a mission. I told Cody that just before I took the stage, he needed to take that flash drive and move toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom. I told him to find a tall man in a dark gray suit posted near the service doors and to hand the drive directly to him, no one else. Cody looked up at me, eyes raw and red. He asked who the man in the gray suit was. I didn't answer that. I simply told him that his entire life, his parents had made every choice on his behalf. They had decided what he believed, who he trusted, and the shape of the world he lived in. But tomorrow night, the choice was entirely his. He could take the drive, walk away, and keep standing with the people who had built their lives on theft and deception. Or he could hand it over and stand with the truth. I lifted my black tea, took a final sip, and rose from the booth. I looked down at the young man wrestling with the hardest decision he'd ever faced. Cody reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers closing firmly around the cold metal drive. He looked up at me and gave a single definitive nod. The battle lines were drawn. The grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel was awash in glittering crystal and the relentless strobe of camera flashes. It was the night of my foundation's annual charity gala, the absolute peak of the city's corporate and social calendar. Out on the sprawling red carpet feeding into the main hall, the media circus was already in full roar. Camera flashes popped like miniature lightning strikes, throwing sharp light across the highest expression of my son's arrogance. Garrett and Renata stood dead center in the media frenzy, soaking up a spotlight they had done nothing whatsoever to earn. They looked like royalty draped in the kind of extravagant luxury that can only be purchased with stolen money. Garrett wore a bespoke charcoal tuxedo that fit him without a wrinkle. Renata stood at his side in a breathtaking floor-length sapphire gown, her neck and wrists heavy with diamonds. I knew precisely what those outfits had cost because the fraud alerts from my corporate credit accounts had been stacking up on my phone all afternoon. They had held nothing back, treating my name and my credit line as a bottomless personal account. They were parading through the spoils of their supposed victory, entirely unaware that every diamond and every thread of silk was adding another charge to their legal reckoning. I stood alone on the curved mezzanine balcony of the second floor, tucked back into the soft shadows, watching the spectacle below. The acoustics of the grand hall carried their voices up to me with perfect clarity. A local financial reporter pushed a microphone toward Garrett, asking about his sudden presence in the city and his connection to my biotech empire. Garrett produced a practiced, devastatingly smooth smile. He pulled Renata close with an arm around her waist, projecting the picture of a devoted family man. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice wrapped in carefully manufactured humility. "My father is a brilliant man," Garrett said evenly, scanning the cluster of reporters. "He has built something truly extraordinary here, but he isn't getting any younger, and the burden of running a global company is weighing on him. I'm here to step up. I'm here to take the reins so that he can finally rest. It is my duty as his son to carry this forward and to look after him in his later years. He has given so much to the world. Now it's time for his family to give something back." Renata nodded beside him, pressing a manicured hand to her heart, performing the role of the devoted, loving daughter-in-law with flawless precision. I gripped the cold marble railing of the balcony. The sheer undiluted poison of it was almost impressive. He stood there absorbing the admiration of the press, casting himself as the loyal heir rushing to his aging father's side. This was the same man who had left me with $150 and a note telling me to figure it out. The same man currently in the crosshairs of a federal investigation for embezzling $4 million from his own investors. He was delivering the performance of his life, piling the pedestal higher and higher, pumping up his own legend until it swallowed the room whole. That was precisely what I wanted. I wanted him to feel the full, intoxicating rush of absolute power. Then a sharp-eyed journalist from a major business publication glanced up and caught me standing on the mezzanine. A ripple moved through the crowd as heads began to tilt upward. The camera flashes swung around, lighting up my face in the shadows. Garrett followed their gaze and looked up at me. That charming smile of his slipped for just a fraction of a second, a flash of nervous anticipation in his eyes before he caught himself and beamed back up at me with counterfeit warmth. Mr. Clifford, the journalist, called out, his voice carrying through the high ceilings of the grand hall. Your son just spoke about the company's future. Will you be stepping down this evening? Are you officially passing the torch and naming him your successor? The entire grand ballroom went dead silent. Hundreds of eyes, including the hungry, desperate eyes of my son and his wife, were locked entirely on me. They were waiting for the validation they believed they had so cleverly maneuvered out of me. They were waiting for me to surrender my life's work publicly into their grasping hands. I rested my hands on the railing and looked straight down at Garrett. I let the silence stretch, letting his anticipation climb to a fever pitch. I offered a slow, composed smile that gave away absolutely nothing. Tonight is a very special night. I projected my voice so every reporter, every investor, and every last guest in the room could hear me clearly. It is a night about legacy, about truth, and about what comes next. I have reached my decision regarding the fate of this company and my fortune, and I promise you tonight everything will go to the one who truly deserves it. The reporters erupted in a flurry of excited chatter, scribbling furiously and snapping photographs. Down in the crowd, Garrett's eyes blazed with euphoric, blinding triumph. Renata visibly exhaled a long, slow breath of relief, her manufactured smile stretching wide across her face. They heard my words and filtered them through the lens of their own monumental narcissism. They were absolutely certain they had claimed the ultimate prize. They had no idea the curtain was about to rise on their complete and total ruin. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and I stepped out onto the main stage of the grand ballroom. The full force of the theatrical spotlight struck me at once, washing the sea of faces into a blur and throwing a brilliant, blinding glow across the podium. As I moved towards center stage, the low hum of hundreds of overlapping conversations began to dissolve. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the soft shuffle of expensive shoes faded entirely until a heavy, expectant silence blanketed the whole hall. This was the moment the city's elite had been building toward all evening. I adjusted the microphone, the metallic scrape ringing out across the room. I looked down into the audience. The harsh stage lighting reduced the back rows to dark, shapeless silhouettes. But the front row was perfectly lit. Standing dead center, practically pressing against the velvet rope separating the stage from the crowd, were Garrett and Renata. They were nearly trembling with anticipation. Garrett had unbuttoned his suit jacket and shifted his weight forward like a sprinter coiled at the starting line. He stared up at me with wide, unblinking eyes, a tight, arrogant smile fixed across his face. He had already raised one hand to his chest, casually straightening his designer silk tie, physically readying himself to climb the steps and accept his coronation. Renata stood shoulder to shoulder with him, her manicured hands clasped tightly before her breathtaking floor-length sapphire gown, gazing up at me with an expression of breathless, manufactured devotion. They were so utterly consumed by their own towering greed that they failed to notice the cold, hollow, completely unyielding look behind my eyes. I leaned into the microphone, my voice ringing out deep and steady, commanding the undivided attention of every person in the room. 15 years ago, I let the words hang in the charged air. 15 years ago, I stood on an empty driveway with nothing but the clothes on my back. I had no home. I had no family. I had exactly $150 to my name. A soft, captivated murmur rippled through the crowd of investors and journalists. They loved this story. To them it was the ultimate American underdog narrative, the visionary founder who rose from the wreckage of personal tragedy to build a biotechnology empire. Down in the front row, Garrett's smile broadened. He nodded along, slowly playing the role of the proud son, assuming this was simply the dramatic prelude to his grand introduction. I built this company on a foundation of absolute survival. I kept my gaze locked directly on Garrett. I spent the last decade and a half securing the future, developing innovations that change lives, and building a legacy of staggering wealth. But true legacy is not simply about what you construct. It is about what you leave behind, and more importantly, who you leave it to. The tension in the grand ballroom reached a fever pitch. Camera flashes intensified into a rapid strobe, capturing the historic moment. Garrett took a half step forward, his polished leather shoes pressing against the velvet rope. He was ready. He was waiting to hear his name. Tonight, I announced the final irrevocable disposition of my entire estate. My voice dropped to a sharp, lethal register. Effective immediately, 100% of my corporate equity, my voting rights, my real estate holdings, and my personal liquid assets are being permanently transferred into a newly established ironclad legal entity. Garrett's chest swelled. He glanced toward the journalists already bracing to absorb their envy. I am officially launching the $150 trust, I declared. Garrett blinked. His arrogant smile froze where it was. A flicker of real bewildered confusion crossed his eyes. Renata's clasped hands slowly dropped to her sides. This foundation, I continued projecting over the sudden confused murmuring of the crowd, is dedicated exclusively to the protection and rehabilitation of elderly individuals who have been victims of severe financial abuse. It will wage absolute legal and financial warfare against those who prey upon the vulnerable. Specifically, it is built to hunt down and prosecute family members, the sons and daughters who manipulate, discard, and rob the very parents who gave them life. The grand ballroom descended into a suffocating absolute silence. The reporters stopped snapping pictures. The wealthy elite stared up at the stage in pure shock. I looked down at the front row. All color had drained entirely from Garrett's face. He looked like a man who had just been hurled from an airplane without a parachute. His mouth hung slightly open, his breathing shallow and rapid. Renata looked as though she might be physically sick. Let me be perfectly clear so there is no confusion whatsoever about the future of my empire, I said, driving the final nail with surgical precision. My wealth belongs to the forgotten. It belongs to the betrayed. It will build a fortress for those left out in the cold. There are no corporate heirs. There will be no generational transfer of wealth. Not a single cent of my fortune will ever pass to my bloodline. The shockwave that tore through the grand ballroom was instantaneous. A collective audible gasp rose from the crowd. Down in the front row, the fragile polished facade of the devoted son shattered completely and violently. The full weight of what had just occurred crashed down on Garrett, snapping something inside him. The billions he had already spent in his imagination evaporated into nothing. The sheer public humiliation broke him. He lurched forward, seizing the velvet rope with both hands, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He did not care about the cameras. He did not care about the hundreds of powerful people witnessing every second. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice shrieking off the grand walls. He accused me of losing my mind. He screamed that I was a senile, crazy old man who had no idea what he was doing. His face darkened to a furious purple as he jabbed a trembling finger up at me, screaming that I had absolutely no right to stand up there and strip away his assets. Garrett kept screaming, face a livid shade of red, demanding that someone put a stop to what I was doing. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not summon security to drag him away. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and produced a small black remote. I aimed it toward the control booth at the back of the room and pressed a single button. The massive digital screen behind me flickered. My biotechnology firm's corporate logo vanished entirely. In its place, a new image filled the grand ballroom, a high-definition 30-foot-tall photograph. It was not a pharmaceutical breakthrough or a blueprint for a new senior care facility. It showed a piece of yellowed torn paper resting beside a crumpled $100 bill and a single $50 bill. The handwriting on the note was blown up to an enormous scale, perfectly legible to every person in the room. It read simply, "You will figure it out." I leaned back into the microphone. My voice perfectly calm and lethal, I told the audience to look closely at the screen. What they were seeing, I explained, was the entire foundation of my billionaire empire. That crumpled note and those two bills, I told them, was the generous inheritance my only son left for me 15 years ago. A wave of confused muttering rolled through the crowd. I did not leave them wondering for long. I told that packed grand ballroom exactly what had happened the week I buried my wife. I described the crushing fog of grief that had left me completely unable to function. I explained how Garrett, the man standing in the front row performing the role of devoted son, had approached me while I was heavily medicated and hollowed out by sorrow. He placed a stack of papers in front of me, claiming they were routine hospital bills and life insurance documents that required my signature. I trusted my son. I signed every page without reading a single word. I then told the crowd how I returned from a walk a few days later to find the locks on my own front door had been changed. The house had been quietly sold out from under me. My son and his wife had packed their belongings, drained our joint bank accounts, and fled across state lines. They left me standing on the porch with nothing in the world but the clothes on my back, that pitiful handful of cash, and a cruel handwritten note. The silence inside the grand ballroom shattered. A collective deafening roar of shock and revulsion erupted from the hundreds of investors, philanthropists, and journalists packed into that hall. The reporters clustered at the edge of the stage instantly understood they had stumbled into the defining corporate scandal of the decade. They swung their heavy cameras away from the podium and trained them directly on the front row. A relentless, blinding barrage of camera flashes hit Garrett square in the face. He stumbled back, throwing both hands up to shield his eyes. That arrogant polish bearing of his collapsed entirely. He looked like a cornered animal, frantically shaking his head and muttering under his breath. The wealthy elites and powerful industry figures who had been shaking his hand and drinking to his future moments before now stepped away from him. They drew back, leaving a wide, empty circle around Garrett and his wife, as though the two of them were carrying something contagious. Garrett tried to speak, tried to mount some kind of defense, but the crowd shouted over him. The public humiliation was total and crushing. The glorious coronation he had been savoring all evening had curdled into a brutal televised execution. Every lie he had fed the media earlier that night was now coiling back around his throat. Renata watched their entire future turn to ash in a matter of seconds. The realization that they would never see a cent of that billion-dollar fortune hit her, followed immediately by the terror of very public destruction. The carefully constructed image of the loving daughter-in-law dissolved instantly. Pure, unhinged panic seized her body. She lunged forward with a sudden violent surge of energy. She ripped a heavy microphone straight out of the hands of a stunned financial reporter standing near the velvet rope. She gripped it with both fists, her knuckles bleaching white, and screamed into the device. Her voice shrieked across the grand speakers and bounced off the high ceilings. She called me a liar. She jabbed a frantic finger toward the stage, her breathing ragged and erratic. She screamed to the crowd that they were listening to a senile old man who was fabricating stories for attention. She desperately tried to construct a new narrative on the fly, shouting that I was the one who had abandoned them. She claimed I had emptied the family accounts and run off with a mistress, leaving her and Garrett to suffer in poverty. She begged the journalists to stop taking pictures, pleading with the investors to disregard every word I had spoken. She was completely unraveling, spiraling deeper into a web of pathetic invented lies. She opened her mouth to hurl another accusation, to cast herself as the ultimate victim. But before she could make another sound, a new voice cut cleanly through the chaos. Young, shaking with raw emotion and amplified across the entire ballroom's sound system. Every camera flash stopped cold. Every single head in the grand hall, including Renata's and Garrett's, swung away from the stage and turned toward the heavy service doors at the back of the room. Renata's shrill, frantic screaming into the microphone died abruptly. Those heavy wooden service doors at the far end of the grand ballroom slammed open with a resounding boom that reverberated through the floorboards. Every camera went still. Hundreds of powerful investors and sharp-eyed journalists turned in unison. Walking down the long center aisle, perfectly lit by the crystal chandeliers overhead, was Cody. My 22-year-old grandson did not look anything like the frightened college student who had sat across from me at that small corner cafe just 24 hours earlier. His shoulders were pulled back. His jaw was set hard. He moved with a heavy, deliberate purpose aimed straight at the brightly lit stage. Renata froze. She stood near the velvet rope, still gripping the stolen microphone, her face pale and slicked with nervous sweat. She stared at her son as though she were looking at a ghost. Garrett, still reeling from the devastating blow of his public exposure, turned and locked eyes with Cody. Garrett demanded to know what he was doing there. He ordered Cody out of the room, told him to go back to the hotel and stay out of adult business. He was reaching for whatever parental authority he had left, trying to salvage the last crumbling fragment of his dignity. But his words landed on completely deaf ears. Cody did not slow down. He did not look at his father. His eyes were fixed entirely on his mother. Cody reached the edge of the stage. He stepped clean over the velvet rope, ignoring the security guards, who were too stunned by the spectacle unfolding in front of them to move. He walked straight up to Renata. She attempted a shaky motherly smile. She reached out a trembling hand and told him to set the record straight, to tell these people that the old man was lying. She begged him to back her story, to tell the press how much they had all suffered. Cody looked down at her. He reached out and took the microphone right out of her sweating hands. He raised it to his mouth, and his voice rang out across the vast, silent grand ballroom. He looked his mother dead in the eye and told her to shut her mouth. A collective gasp tore through the elite audience. Reporters scrambled to bring their cameras back up, capturing every agonizing second of this family's destruction. Renata stumbled backward as though she had taken a physical blow. Cody turned his back on his mother and faced the wall of journalists. He did not hesitate. He told the absolute unvarnished truth. He announced his name into the microphone and declared that everything I had just said was completely true. He told the silent, packed room that his entire life his parents had fed him a poisonous, sickening lie. They told him his grandfather was a coward who had drained the family accounts and run away. Cody paused, his voice shaking with raw emotion, but he did not back down. He pointed a finger directly at Garrett. He told the crowd that his father was a thief and a fraud. He revealed that, just the day before, he had uncovered the truth. He told them how his parents had left his grandfather homeless, with exactly $150 to his name. He explained how they had fled the state and constructed their fraudulent luxury lifestyle on the back of a grieving old man. Cody looked at the investors in the front row and told them his parents had not come to this gala to honor a legacy. They had come to steal whatever remained of it because their own real estate business was entirely bankrupt. They came to use a 72-year-old man as a human shield against their own catastrophic crimes. The grand ballroom erupted into total, absolute chaos. Journalists shouted questions over one another, their voices merging into a deafening roar. Investors pulled out their phones, frantically calling their financial advisors to pull any backing connected to Garrett. The public execution was absolute and flawless. Renata buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically, as the twin realities of prison and poverty crashed over her. But Garrett did not cry. The last remaining thread of his sanity snapped completely. The son he had spent years manipulating, the boy he had controlled, his entire life had just plunged a knife through his public image in front of the most powerful people in the city. Pure, unadulterated rage blinded Garrett. He let out a feral, completely unhinged scream that cut right through the noise of the crowd. He dropped his head and charged the stage like a rabid animal. He vaulted over the velvet rope, eyes locked entirely on Cody. He raised his fist, preparing to land a devastating, violent blow on his own son, just to make him stop talking. He wanted to punish the boy for tearing his empire down around him. He wanted to silence the truth by force, but he had completely forgotten who else was standing on that stage. What I'm about to share with you is the moment everything that had been building every quiet year, every careful move, finally came due. Before we get there, let me ask you something. If you had spent years watching someone walk away with what was yours, would you expose them publicly, or would you let the law handle it alone? Security could wait. I didn't so much as blink. 40 years of clawing through nothing had turned my reflexes to iron. The moment Garrett launched himself at Cody, I cut across his path. Both palms hit him square in the sternum, hard, deliberate, final. All that charging momentum crashed straight into a man with zero left to lose. Garrett's legs went out from under him. He reeled backward, arms wheeling for something that wasn't there. The downtown luxury hotel's security detail hit the stage before he could find his footing, 6 broad-shouldered guards in dark suits closing in from every angle at once. They brought him down in a heap, wrenching his arms back and grinding his face into the polished boards. The crack of his body meeting the floor punched through the live microphone Cody had left lying on the stage. Garrett bucked and screamed obscenities against the hardwood, while the guards locked his wrists behind him. Every trace of the charming executive had been stripped away, leaving nothing but a writhing, humiliated criminal on display for the whole world to see. The ruin of my son was going out live to millions of viewers, and still the night had one more move to make. The killing stroke had been waiting quietly in the wings all along. The camera flashes kept detonating as the crowd split apart a second time, opening a corridor for what came next. 6 guards kept Garrett pressed flat to the floor, his bespoke charcoal tuxedo bunching and shredding under the weight of the men holding him. He twisted and heaved like something caught in a trap face mashed against the stage, sucking air in shallow, ragged pulls. Everyone in that hall had gone completely still. The The billionaires, the venture capitalists, the press, every one of them, stood motionless, absorbing the wreckage of a man who had genuinely believed he was untouchable. That was when a figure stepped out of the darkness at the back of the stage. Conrad, my chief legal counsel. He came forward at a deliberate, unhurried pace, the walk of a man who knows the verdict is already sealed, not a flicker of feeling on his face. Tucked under his arm was a thick manila folder with bold red text stamped across its cover. The stage lights hit those red letters the second he cleared the curtain line. Conrad crossed over the abandoned microphone without breaking stride and planted himself directly above where Garrett lay pinned. Garrett wrenched his head sideways and looked up. His face was flush-sheened with sweat, and behind his eyes something had shifted, a recognition that whatever Conrad was holding was going to finish him. Conrad gave him nothing, not a word, not a look of acknowledgement. He just opened his hand and let the folder fall. It hit the floor with a flat, emphatic crack right beside my son's face. Papers slid out and fanned across the hardwood, lit up perfectly by the stage lights above. Every journalist in the front row surged forward, lenses dropping toward the scattered pages. The federal seal at the top of the forensic accounting report filled their frames. Conrad reached down and retrieved the microphone Cody had dropped. One tap to confirm it was live, the thud rolling through the grand ballroom speakers. Then he looked down at Garrett and delivered each word like a scalpel. He stated that Garrett had shown up at my private boardroom just 24 hours earlier, making aggressive demands for a $2 million loan to prop up his failing real estate empire. Every syllable carried flat and certain across the entire room. He continued the story about a temporary market downturn was a lie from start to finish. The forensic audit spread across that floor. He announced, established beyond any doubt, that Garrett had stolen $4 million from his own private investors. The crowd's reaction hit like a wave, a single enormous intake of breath. The people who had been clinking glasses with Garrett not an hour ago stepped backward as if he'd become something dangerous. Several of them already had their phones out dialing to cut any financial exposure before another minute passed. Cameras devoured the scattered bank records, the shell companies, the counterfeit vendor invoices, all of it laid bare under the lights. The fraud wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a documented, broadcast, inescapable fact. The fight went out of Garrett all at once. His body just quit. His gaze crawled across the documents, inches from his face. He clocked the highlighted wire transfers. He clocked the transaction dates. The furious entitlement that had sent him charging at his own son dissolved like it had never existed. He wasn't an angry man anymore. He was a finished one, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. In the front row, Renata sank to her knees, both hands clutching her breathtaking floor-length sapphire gown, crying without restraint as the full scope of what they had lost crashed through her. The penthouse, the cars, the inheritance they'd been counting on, all of it ash. What was left was poverty and a prison sentence, and she knew it. Then, cutting through the stillness that had settled over the grand ballroom, came a sound from outside. Faint at first, a distant wail threading between the buildings, but building fast, layering on itself, growing impossible to ignore. Police sirens, multiple units growing louder as patrol cars and federal transport vehicles closed on the downtown luxury hotel from every direction. The sound pushed through the walls and glass, filling the ballroom, filling the inside of my son's skull. Something broke loose in him. He started fighting the guards again, shoulders twisting, legs kicking, hunting frantically for any gap, any angle of escape. He screamed that it was a setup, that the documents were forged, but the words dissolved into something closer to a whimper. He threw himself against the hands holding him and stared at the rear exit like a man watching the last door in the world swing shut. Outside, the sirens peaked a pitch that shook the chandeliers and their fittings. The grand ballroom's main doors swung open, the brass handles turning before the panels flew wide. Every murmur in the room cut off. A line of uniformed officers poured in and fanned across the exits. But the uniforms weren't the ones out front. 4 men led the column, dark gray suits pressed and exact. They moved as a single unit, synchronized, expressionless, absolute. Gold shields hung at their belts, and from lanyards at their chests, FBI. I knew their faces. They were the ones I'd shown Cody earlier that night. The men who'd been stationed at the service doors. The men now holding the flash drive packed with every scrap of evidence needed to seal Garrett inside a federal penitentiary for whatever years he had left. The crowd folded back ahead of them, billionaires and journalists alike. scrambling sideways to clear the aisle. The agents looked at none of it. No cameras, no guests, no spectacle. Their line ran straight to the stage and didn't deviate. Garrett ground his cheek against the floor, craning to see what was coming. The moment those gold badges caught the light, something in him simply gave out shoulders, dropping a thin, involuntary sound leaking from his throat. His eyes found Cody at the edge of the stage. The understanding arrived all at once. He finally knew whose hands that flash drive had ended up in. What he felt in that instant, that was betrayal. But it was a shadow of nothing beside what he'd done to me 15 years ago. The lead agent mounted the stage shoes, grinding across the forensic documents Conrad had scattered. He gave a nod to the hotel guards. They lifted Garrett to his knees and stepped away. The agent stood over my son and unclipped a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Then he read the charges, voice loud and even carrying to every corner of the hall. Wire fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny. Conspiracy to defraud investors of $4 million. Each count landed like something physical, another beam knocked out from under the empire Garrett had constructed on lies. While his rights were being read aloud, a sudden frantic motion in the front row pulled my eyes downward. Renata had been on her knees in the front row, frozen by the scale of their public annihilation. But the moment a federal prison cell stopped being abstract and became something she could actually see materializing in front of her, the paralysis broke, and what replaced it was raw, unhinged terror. The stolen corporate credit cards, the designer wardrobe, the luxury cars she understood in an instant, they were all already gone. Her freedom was evaporating in real time. She lurched forward, her expensive, breathtaking floor-length sapphire gown snagging and ripping on the leg of a camera tripod. She made it to the edge of the stage on her hands and knees, mascara cutting black rivers through her ruined makeup. Her face had shed every trace of composure. She reached up past the velvet rope and seized my pant leg with both hands gripping hard, her diamond rings throwing sparks of light under the stage floods as her fingers dug into the fabric of my suit. "Dad!" She choked out, her voice spiraling into a shrill, desperate pitch. "Dad, please, you have to stop them. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. We can make this right. We can return every cent. Please don't let them take us. We are family. You have to save us. We are your family." She peered up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and wide, begging the same man she had mocked and stripped of everything just years before. She was waiting for the soft, forgiving grandfather to surface and absorb the punishment she had earned with her own hands. She genuinely believed the word family still carried any meaning between us. I looked down at the woman who had helped engineer my destruction. I looked at those hands, the same ones that had eagerly boxed up my belongings while I was still raw with grief over my wife's death. I searched inside myself for anger. I found none. No pity either. What I felt was cold, clean, absolute clarity. I didn't crouch down. I didn't offer a single syllable of comfort. I held her gaze and in one slow, deliberate motion, drew my leg back and let her trembling fingers fall away from my suit. She pitched forward slightly, palms slapping the stage floor. I looked down at her crumpled, tear-soaked face. I leaned in just far enough that my voice would reach her and Garrett, but no one else low enough to be private, sharp enough to land like a blade. I looked at the two people who had burned my past to the ground, and I handed them their future. "You will figure it out," I said. The identical words they had scrawled on that yellowed note 15 years ago. The exact phrase they had used to send me out into the street with nothing. Hearing those words come back to her dismantled whatever remained of Renata's composure. She folded against the velvet rope and buried her face in her hands, wailing in pure, inescapable despair, while the federal agents hauled her husband upright and cinched the steel cuffs tight around his wrists. That sharp metallic click, the handcuffs locking onto my son's wrists, rang out above the fading sirens outside. That one small mechanical sound seemed to sever the last thread holding him together. Garrett did not bow his head. He didn't absorb his fate with even a scrap of dignity. Instead, some raw-cornered survival reflex seized him completely. He wrenched his upper body sideways, straining against the agents gripping his arms, and swung his bloodshot, furious eyes straight at his wife. Renata was still slumped against the velvet rope, her sapphire gown torn and ruined, mascara streaking her pale face in long black lines. Garrett looked at the woman he had partnered with to dismantle my life, and without one beat of hesitation, he threw her directly under the wheels. He shouted at the federal agents, his voice breaking apart with panic. He demanded they arrest her instead. He screamed he wasn't the architect of any of it, that Renata had designed the entire scheme from the beginning. He jerked his cuffed wrists toward her and yelled that she was the one who engineered the sale of my house 15 years ago. He told the journalists and investors crowded around him that Renata had forged the legal documents and manipulated the power of attorney while I was heavily medicated and drowning in grief. The sheer spectacle of his betrayal was something to behold. He was perfectly willing to sacrifice the mother of his child if it carved even 1 month off his federal sentence. The moment those accusations hit her, Renata's sobbing stopped cold. Her despair flipped into venomous, concentrated fury. Every trace of the polished society wife evaporated on the spot. She hauled herself up off the floor, ignoring the shredded silk trailing behind her, and drove herself straight at her husband. A hotel security guard had to catch her by the shoulders before she could get her hands on Garrett's face. She screamed right back at him, her voice stripped of everything except pure, unhinged rage. She told the agents not to believe a word out of his mouth. She called Garrett a pathological liar, a coward, a degenerate. She pitched her voice over the noise filling the grand ballroom and told every journalist and investor within earshot that Garrett had personally driven his own real estate firm into the ground through sheer catastrophic incompetence. She screamed that he was the one who had personally stolen the $4 million from his private investors. She told the room he hadn't lost it in a bad market, he had blown every cent of it on illegal offshore gambling and catastrophic hidden debts. She was confessing at full volume to the entire crowd, frantic and reckless, declaring she had only gone along with the credit card fraud because Garrett had bankrupted their entire family and threatened to walk away and leave her with nothing. The immaculate fiction of their happy, successful marriage was shredded in front of hundreds of camera lenses, all firing at once. It was mutual demolition, absolute and total. 2 people standing under the stage lights, voluntarily detonating each other, confessing to serious federal crimes just to guarantee the other one went down too. Drowning rats clawing over each other for one last breath of air. The federal agents didn't need to press anyone. They stepped back and let the 2 of them scream their own confessions into the open room while the journalists captured every damning word. Every microphone in the grand ballroom picked it up and fed it out to the world. Eventually, the lead agent gave a single firm nod. 2 officers stepped in, took Renata by the arms, yanked her hands behind her back, and locked a second pair of steel handcuffs onto her wrists. She kicked and twisted her heels, skidding across the polished floor, still screaming at Garrett. Garrett kept shouting over her voice, cracking, begging the agents for a plea deal, promising to testify against his wife, as they dragged him backward down the long center aisle of the grand ballroom. The guests cleared a path without a word. The billionaires, the industry titans, the press, every one of them watched in horrified, rigid silence as the couple who had arrived, looking like corporate royalty, were marched out like criminals. The grand ballroom's heavy wooden doors closed behind them with a deep, definitive thud, swallowing their screaming whole. The camera flashes faded out one by one. The frantic electric charge that had saturated the room bled away, leaving something vast and hollow in its place. I stood at the center of the stage and looked out over the silent, shell-shocked hall. I found Conrad, my attorney, in the crowd below. He gave me a slow, measured nod of acknowledgement. I looked across to Cody, my grandson, who stood staring at those closed doors with the empty expression of someone processing something permanent and irreversible. The grand hall held its silence. The storm had finally blown itself out. The war I had waged without a single public word was finished. My empire was intact. The order I had spent 15 years rebuilding fully restored. Everything that had made this room violent and electric, the shouting reporters, the blinding cameras, the federal agents walking my son out in handcuffs, had dissolved, gone. What the lights now revealed was wreckage. Shattered champagne flutes, abandoned napkins. The trampled, scattered pages of Conrad's forensic accounting report spread across the expensive hardwood. The elite guests had cleared out quickly, wanting no part of the fallout from my family's very public disintegration. I stood at the edge of the stage, the silence pressing down around me, and let my eyes move across the vast, empty room. There in the shadows, pooled beneath the grand, sweeping staircase, was Cody. My 22-year-old grandson had completely collapsed. He was on the bottom marble step, elbows on his knees, face buried in both hands. His shoulders heaved with silent, convulsive sobs. He had just watched federal agents escort his mother and father out of that building in handcuffs, bound for decades behind bars. He had stood before the entire world and dismantled the only family he had ever had. I knew precisely what was crushing him right then. It wasn't simply the wound of betrayal, it was the suffocating, terrifying weight of his new reality settling onto him. An hour ago, he was a privileged heir to a sprawling real estate fortune, a young man who had never lost a night's sleep over a credit card statement or a tuition bill. Now he was the son of 2 federal felons. His family name had been permanently scorched by one of the biggest fraud scandals the city had ever seen. The trust fund his parents had dangled in front of him his whole life was gone without a trace, replaced by a mountain of student loan debt that now belonged entirely to him. He had nothing. He was on his own. A younger man, a softer version of me, might have crossed that ballroom floor, sat down beside him on those steps, and pulled him close. Might have told him it would all be fine, that I'd handle it, that a large enough check could absorb the pain. But hard experience had taught me that sheltering a young man from the true weight of consequences doesn't protect him. It hollows him out. That exact brand of blind, unconditional financial rescue was what had shaped his father into the thing I had just watched hauled away in handcuffs. I had no intention of repeating that error. A few yards off, a hotel janitor had crept out from the service corridor, clutching a wide floor broom, hovering uncertainly at the edge of the room, as if unsure whether the wreckage was his to touch. I walked over to him, reached out and took the broom from his hands without a word. Then I turned and moved slowly across the debris-strewn floor, my shoes striking the hardwood in steady, deliberate clicks until I was standing directly in front of my grandson. Cody did not look up. He just sat there crying, entirely consumed by his own devastating grief. I didn't lower myself to his level. I didn't offer a soft word or a gentle hand on the shoulder. I extended the broom in front of me and let it go. The handle hit the marble steps with a sharp, resounding clatter, landing just inches from his expensive leather shoes. Cody jerked back, pulling his hands from his tear-streaked face. He dropped his gaze to the broom, then lifted it slowly to me, his red, swollen eyes full of pure bewilderment. "You did a very brave thing tonight, Cody," I said, my voice level and carrying the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need volume. "You stood in front of the whole world and chose the truth over a comfortable, profitable lie. I respect that. But sitting on the floor of a luxury hotel sobbing is not going to retire your student debt. It is not going to put food on your table, and it is certainly not going to rebuild your reputation." Cody stared at me, breath catching in his throat. He was waiting for the rescue, waiting for the billionaire grandfather to open a checkbook and erase the terrifying blank space his future had become. I held his gaze and dismantled that expectation on the spot. "The illusion of your wealth is finished," I told him, sweeping a hand toward the empty wreckage-filled grand ballroom around us. "Your parents spent their whole lives trying to steal their way upward because hard work frightened them. They taught you how to wear an expensive suit and how to carry yourself like you were above everyone else in the room. What they never taught you was how to actually survive. That changes tonight. Pick up the broom, Cody. Start clearing this mess. Honest work will straighten your head out." The silence between us was heavy and absolute. I watched the conflict move across his young, wet face. His eyes went to the broom, then out across the daunting expanse of the ruined ballroom floor. For one long, unsteady moment, I thought the toxic entitlement his parents had spent years instilling was going to win. I thought it was going to root him to the spot. But then Cody dragged the back of his sleeve across his face. He pulled in a deep, shuddering breath, reached forward, and closed both hands firmly around the broom handle. He pushed himself to his feet, standing above the debris, and took his very first step forward. It was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do, and it was the first real lesson in unforgiving independence his parents had never once bothered to give him. The morning air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp soil. A taxi pulled to the curb, and Cody stepped out, looking wrung out, but with a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there the night before. He had spent every hour between midnight and dawn sweeping that grand ballroom clean. The grinding physical labor had burned away the last residue of the entitled life he'd been raised in. He came up the short gravel driveway, slowly taking in the surroundings with quiet disbelief. This was my actual home, not an estate behind iron gates, not a glass penthouse above the financial district. A solid, unpretentious wooden house set back in a quiet suburb. The lawn was trimmed neat, the front porch was modest, the paint was a calm shade of gray. I had built this life deliberately as far from the blinding lights and corrosive greed of the corporate world as I could get. I was seated on the wooden porch bench with a mug of black tea watching him come up the walk. Cody climbed the 3 porch steps and stood before me. He didn't look like the polished heir his parents had been sculpting. He looked like a young man who had just clawed his way out of a very long, very dark dream. He kept his eyes on the floorboards for a long moment before finally raising them to meet mine. When he spoke, his voice was weighted with shame. He told me he was profoundly sorry for what his parents had done. He apologized for living comfortably on money taken from me, and for never once questioning the version of events he had been fed his entire life. I took a measured sip of tea and gave a slow nod. I told him an apology was a reasonable beginning, but that words cost nothing. What a man did after the apology, that was where character actually lived. Cody swallowed, shifting on his feet. He told me his whole world had been turned upside down. With his parents facing federal charges and every asset they held frozen by the government, he was starting from zero. His university tuition was severely past due, and there was a crushing pile of debt his father had quietly taken out in his name without ever telling him. His voice thinned slightly as he got to the question I had known was coming from the moment he stepped out of that cab. He asked if I could lend him money, just a modest cash loan. He said enough to settle the most pressing debts and keep him from being evicted from his campus apartment. He would pay back every last cent once he had his degree and a steady job. I didn't pause to think about it. I set the mug down on the small table beside the bench, met his eyes squarely, and told him absolutely not. Not 1 cent in cash. Cody looked as though I'd slapped him. He started to say something, maybe to plead, maybe to argue, but I raised a hand and stopped him before the words formed. I told him that handing over cash was the identical mistake I'd made with his father. Unconditional financial rescue was a slow poison. It had made Garrett into a lazy, entitled criminal who believed the world was obligated to provide for him. I told Cody plainly that I loved him far too much to pass that same disease along. I was not going to produce a check and steal from him the chance to learn what it meant to stand on his own. I reached down beside the bench and picked up a plain manila folder from the floor. I handed it to him. He took it with unsteady hands and opened it. Inside was a legally binding contract I had drawn up with Conrad early that morning. I walked him through the terms without softening any of them. My foundation would pay his university tuition directly to the school. Not a single dollar would pass through his own account. In exchange for that support, he was required to work 20 hours a week as a clerk at the $150 trust. He would be filing paperwork, answering phones, and directly serving the elderly victims his parents had so savagely dismissed. I told him he would draw a standard hourly wage, and that wage, every cent of it, would go toward his own rent, his own groceries, and his own outstanding debts. No luxury vehicles, no designer labels, and not a single free pass. Cody read through the document with care. I watched his face, holding my breath, to see whether the toxic pride his mother had hammered into him would suddenly ignite. I braced for him to fling the folder aside and storm off in disgust, too insulted by the prospect of honest labor to stay, but he didn't. Something deep and genuine seemed to settle across his exhausted features. His whole life, his parents had wielded money like a weapon, buying his loyalty and keeping him caged inside their comfortable lies. This contract was an entirely different animal. It was an honest, unapologetic line in the sand. It was a genuine shot at earning his own place in the world. Head up, Cody lifted his eyes from the page, and something new lived in them, a quiet, unshakable resolve. He asked me for a pen. I pulled the brass pen from my shirt pocket and handed it over. He pressed the folder flat against the wooden porch railing and signed his name at the bottom without a moment's pause. The line had been drawn. The foundation for something real had finally been laid. 6 months rolled forward with the relentless, unstoppable force of a freight train. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, cutting off the chaotic din of the press pack gathered on the front marble steps. The courtroom was packed to the last seat. Journalists, former investors, onlookers, hungry to witness the closing chapter of the city's most notorious family betrayal. I sat in the polished wooden chair of the witness stand, calmly straightening the cuffs of my tailored suit. Across the wide aisle at the stark metal defense table sat Garrett and Renata. They bore no resemblance to the arrogant corporate royalty who had glided down the red carpet half a year before. The bespoke suits and sapphire gowns were long gone. swapped out for dull, shapeless standard-issue prison jumpsuits. Garrett looked entirely hollowed out. His posture had caved inward. His complexion was ashen, his eyes skittering nervously around the imposing room. I looked at him and felt not 1 ounce of pity. No surge of fury either. What I felt was a pristine, freezing clarity, the calm of a man delivering consequences that were long, long overdue. The prosecuting attorney approached the stand and courteously asked me to state my name for the record. I leaned toward the microphone and spoke with cold, unwavering precision. For the next 2 hours, I answered every question put to me. I walked through the exact timeline of their deception, tracing every thread of their betrayal, without shedding a tear, without a tremor in my voice, without offering the slightest crack of vulnerability. The defense attorney tried to shake me, to cast me as a vindictive billionaire, nursing a petty grudge, but my composure was solid iron. I refused to give my son the satisfaction of watching me fracture. I laid out the cold, hard facts of his treachery and let the sheer brutality of what he had done speak entirely for itself. The prosecutor then pivoted away from the defense table and crossed to the jury box, signaling the court clerk to bring up the evidence projector. He didn't stop at the $4 million embezzlement that had drawn federal agents to the gala. He went far deeper. He pulled records going back 15 years. The glowing screen behind the judge threw light on the original deed to my old suburban home, placed side by side with the power of attorney paperwork, authorizing the secret sale. The prosecutor followed that with a verified forensic microscopic analysis of the signatures. The forgery was beyond dispute. I explained to the silent, breathless courtroom precisely how Garrett had engineered the theft, how he had buried those specific pages inside a thick stack of hospital bills and insurance forms, while I lay heavily medicated, numb, and deep in grief over the death of my late wife. I watched the 12 jurors as the full weight of what they were seeing settled over them. Several physically recoiled, their faces twisting in undisguised revulsion. They saw the calculated predatory forgery from 15 years ago, set perfectly alongside the fresh bank statements recording his stolen investor funds. The full sprawling arc of his greed was laid bare for the world to see. He had been a ruthless thief his entire adult life, stealing first from a grieving father, then from the people who had foolishly placed their trust in his hands. Garrett sank lower in his chair, unable to meet the screen, unable to face the jury, entirely unable to look at me. The trial did not linger. The paper trail was too overwhelming, the digital evidence too damning to argue against. When the jury foreman rose to deliver the verdict, the tension in that room was suffocating. Guilty on all charges. The words rang through the hushed courtroom like a heavy steel vault door sealing shut forever. The federal judge, a stern, unsparing woman with zero tolerance for white-collar crime, did not temper herself at sentencing. She looked directly down from the bench at Garrett and Renata, her voice cutting through the room with sharp, unmistakable contempt. She called their conduct a sickening display of profound moral bankruptcy, noting that they had turned family trust into a financial weapon for purely selfish ends. She raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, echoing crack. She sentenced them both to 15 years in federal penitentiary. 15 years. A perfectly poetic, devastating symmetry, 1 year behind bars for every single year I had spent clawing my life back from the ashes they had made of it. Garrett did not cry out. He didn't scream or thrash against the bailiffs the way he had at the charity gala. He simply dropped his head, his forehead coming to rest against the cold metal of the defense table's shoulders, caving under the crushing weight of a reality that had finally broken through. The terrible arithmetic of his own choices was running through his mind. He had thrown away a guaranteed inheritance, a billion-dollar biotechnology empire. He had forfeited wealth beyond anything he could have imagined, all because he was too impatient, too consumed by greed to earn $2 million the honest way. He had traded his freedom, driven away his only son, and incinerated his entire future for absolutely nothing. The heavy silence held as the bailiffs stepped forward. They gripped Garrett by the arms and pulled him to his feet, ready to take him away. He threw one last broken glance back toward the witness stand, but I was already turning away, perfectly at peace with the justice that had finally arrived. The visitor room of the federal penitentiary was a masterpiece of sterile, soul-crushing architecture. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing everything in a sickly pallor across the rows of scratched plastic chairs and thick reinforced plexiglass dividers. I sat perfectly still in my assigned seat. I was not anxious. My pulse was as steady as a grandfather clock. I hadn't come to offer forgiveness, and I hadn't come looking for closure. I was there to place a final definitive period at the end of a very long sentence. The heavy steel door on the far side of the room buzzed and clicked open. A correctional officer guided my son into the visitor area. I watched Garrett cross toward the glass, and for one brief moment it was hard to reconcile the figure in front of me with the polished, arrogant real estate mogul from 6 months ago. The bespoke charcoal tuxedo had been replaced by an oversized faded khaki jumpsuit. His posture was entirely broken. His shoulders curled inward, his hair unkempt and graying hard at the temples. The crushing weight of a 15-year federal sentence had aged him a decade in just a handful of months. He lowered himself heavily onto the metal stool on his side of the glass. With trembling hands, he reached out and lifted the black plastic telephone receiver. I mirrored him, bringing the handset to my ear. For a long moment, the line held nothing but silence, nothing except the harsh, uneven sound of his breathing. He looked at me through the smudged plexiglass, his eyes red and raw. Dad," he whispered, his voice fracturing. "Thank you for coming. I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again." I said nothing. I let his words float in the sterile air between us. The silence pressed back, forcing him to keep talking, to fill the void with whatever he had rehearsed on his bunk in that cell. He leaned toward the glass, his forehead touching the barrier. "I am so sorry." He choked out, his voice soaked in a pathetic, desperate anguish. "I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I lost everything, Dad. I lost my company, my wife, my son. I sit in that cell every single night, thinking about what I did to you. I just want you to know how deeply sorry I am." I listened to his apology. It rang completely hollow, drained of any genuine remorse. It was the contrition of a man sorry that he'd been caught, not a man who felt the weight of the pain he'd inflicted. I kept my face an absolute mask of stone, giving him nothing to read, nothing to use. When he understood that his tearful performance wasn't going to crack my armor, he wiped his face and shifted in his seat. The sorrow evaporated instantly, replaced by a familiar creeping urgency. The parasitic core of his personality could only stay buried for so long. "It is so hard in here, Dad." His tone glided smoothly from remorseful to whining. "The food is completely inedible. The conditions are terrible. I have absolutely nothing left. They cleared out all of my accounts. Cody won't even answer my letters. I am completely alone." He paused, swallowing hard, and fixed me with a desperate, hungry look. "I was wondering," he stammered, "if you could just do me one tiny favor. Just a small deposit into my prison commissary account. Just enough so I can buy some decent food and basic supplies. You have billions, Dad. A few hundred would mean absolutely nothing to you, but it would change my entire life in here." There it was, the undeniable, unvarnished truth of who my son actually was. Even after watching his entire world collapse around him, even after drawing a 15-year sentence in federal penitentiary for large-scale financial fraud, his very first impulse upon seeing the father he had betrayed was to extend his hand. The greed wasn't a phase. It was a terminal condition, hardwired into his very DNA. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lay into him for his breathtaking nerve. Instead, I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and drew out a small silver money clip. Deliberately, I slid 2 specific bills free from under the metal clasp. I held them up, positioning them just inches from the thick plexiglass, so the harsh fluorescent light fell across them clearly. One crisp $100 bill, one crisp $50 bill. Garrett stopped whining. He stared at the money, his brow creasing in confusion. He watched as I folded the 2 bills together neatly. I leaned forward and fed them through the narrow transaction slot at the base of the heavy glass divider. The folded bills settled quietly on the metal ledge on his side. Garrett looked down at them. He looked back up at me, eyes darting, scanning my face for an explanation. "Why?" he asked, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Why exactly 150? I kept the black plastic receiver pressed firmly against my ear. "Because, Garrett," I said, my voice frozen and steady, "that is exactly what you left me." I watched the realization move through him like a physical blow. I watched his mind snap back 15 years to a cold, empty driveway. He remembered the locks that had been changed. He remembered loading up his car and pulling away. He remembered abandoning his grieving father with nothing but a crumpled wad of bills and a cruel handwritten note telling me to figure it out. The devastating poetry of the moment crushed him entirely. He stared down at the $150 sitting on the metal ledge as the full spectrum of his public and private ruin washed over him in a violent wave. It wasn't a lifeline. It was a mirror angled to throw his own monstrousness back in his face. Garrett buried his face in his hands and broke into loud, uncontrollable sobs. These were not a performance. They were tears of profound, inescapable shame. He wept as the crushing reality of a 15-year sentence finally anchored itself somewhere deep in his chest. I offered no parting comfort. I pulled the heavy plastic receiver from my ear and set it gently back on its hook, sealing off the sound of his crying. I rose from the hard plastic chair. I buttoned my suit jacket, squared my shoulders, and lifted my chin. I turned and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors of the visitor center. I did not look back. My posture was perfectly straight, completely unburdened by the ghost of the son I once knew. The last thread binding me to a lifetime of unappreciated sacrifice had been cut clean, every trace of pity severed with it. 2 years slipped past, but the quiet, steady rhythm of a life finally lived on my own terms. I found myself in the front row of a vast sunlit university stadium. The morning air was warm and alive with the buzzing energy of graduation day. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal suite, hands resting easily in my lap. I wasn't there as a corporate titan or a billionaire philanthropist. I was simply a grandfather, waiting to watch a young man who had rebuilt his life entirely from scratch. The sea of students in their black caps and flowing gowns spread out before me. Cody was seated among them. He looked nothing at all like the shattered, terrified boy who had crumpled on the marble steps of a luxury hotel 2 years before. He had transformed completely. He'd logged 20 hard hours a week filing paperwork at my foundation, while carrying a demanding course load at the university. He'd covered his own rent, bought his own groceries, and learned in his bones what it means to earn your place in the world. He hadn't asked me for a single cent since the morning we signed that employment contract on my front porch. A heavy hush settled across the sprawling stadium as the university dean stepped to the wooden podium to introduce the valedictory speaker. When the dean called Cody's name, a wave of pride moved through me, so deep it almost hurt. Cody rose and climbed the steps to the main stage with a strong, unhurried stride. He adjusted the microphone and looked out over the crowd of proud families and graduating students. He did not speak about his mother or his father. He did not mention the scandal that had played out on the front pages or the federal prison sentences that had shattered his former life. Instead, he spoke about the hard, unforgiving weight of reality and what true independence actually costs. Cody gripped the edges of the podium, and his voice rang out clear and steady across the stadium speakers. He told the thousands of people listening that the greatest lesson he had ever learned did not come from a textbook or a lecture hall. He said it came in the form of a wide floor broom and a crumpled 150s. He talked about how easy it is to become ensnared in the toxic illusion of privilege and how completely blinding unearned wealth can be. He told the crowd that real survival isn't about finding someone willing to pull you up when you fall. He said, true survival is about finding the absolute internal strength to stand back up on your own 2 feet when nobody else is coming to save you. Cody paused and looked directly down to the front row, his eyes locking onto mine. The entire stadium seemed to hold its breath as he delivered his final words. He said the man who saved his life didn't do it by writing a check or offering a comfortable lie. He said the man who saved him did it by drawing a hard, unforgiving line and demanding absolute accountability. He smiled a strong, genuine smile and told the silent crowd that the man who taught him the true value of a hard-earned dollar and the meaning of self-respect was his grandfather. The applause that tore through the stadium was deafening. I sat in my chair as the roar washed over me, feeling a warmth spread through my chest, unlike anything I could name. I didn't clap wildly or call out his name, but the quiet satisfaction running through me was deeper than any corporate triumph I had ever known. The boy had finally become a man. After the ceremony, the manicured lawns of the campus dissolved into a joyful chaos of families, posing for photographs and wrapping each other in embraces. I stood near the edge of the graduation stage, waiting. Cody worked his way through the crowd and walked straight toward me, his hard-earned diploma held firmly in his right hand. He stopped directly in front of me. We didn't trade 1,000 emotional words. We didn't need to. There was a clarity between us, the kind that only comes from mutual absolute respect. A fellow student passing by offered to take a photograph of us. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my grandson, both of us facing the camera. I didn't arrange my face into any polished camera-ready expression. For the first time in more than 15 years, a real smile, an unguarded one, broke across my face. It reached all the way to my eyes. Looking at the young man standing beside me, I understood that the wreckage of a deeply toxic family had been swept clean. In its place stood something new, a foundation built on honesty, unyielding boundaries, and a love that had finally been genuinely earned. I returned to the quiet sanctuary of my private study at the top of the city. The polished walnut desk was bare, except for a single thick leather-bound folder centered precisely on its surface. Conrad stood near the heavy wooden doors, his familiar canvas briefcase at his side. He said nothing as I crossed the room and opened the folder. It was the comprehensive annual impact report for the $150 trust. I ran my fingers across the crisp pages, slowly taking in the sheer scale of what we had built together over the past 24 months. The figures on those pages were staggering. The foundation had fully funded aggressive legal defense teams for more than 3,000 elderly individuals across the country. These were vulnerable people being actively defrauded, manipulated, and terrorized by their own flesh and blood. I read through the briefing summaries detailing how our network of relentless corporate attorneys had frozen illegal asset transfers and clawed back stolen retirement funds. We had fought forged powers of attorney and placed hundreds of predatory family members behind bars. I read about a 70-year-old widow who had been locked out of her own home by her daughter. Through our rapid legal intervention, she was sleeping safely in her own bed tonight, while her daughter awaited federal trial. The small, pathetic sum my son had left on that kitchen counter had grown into an unstoppable engine of pure, relentless justice. I closed the heavy folder and felt a profound weight lift from my shoulders. I moved slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The late afternoon sun was throwing long, golden shadows across the city skyline, painting the glass towers in deep shades of copper and amber. I looked out over the vast grid of streets below, and an absolute unshakable stillness settled itself inside my chest. For 15 long years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my son's betrayal. I had spent countless sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, turning over the question of where I had failed as a father. I had agonized over how the boy I raised had hardened into something so cold and calculating, something willing to leave me to rot on the street. But standing at that window with the sunlight fading across the city, the truth finally became undeniable. The corruption was never something I caused. Greed is a terminal, insidious disease that some people simply choose to let in. I didn't destroy my son or his wife. I didn't reach for some petty emotional revenge. I removed the cushion of my wealth, held a massive mirror up to their moral bankruptcy, and stepped back. I simply allowed them to absorb the devastating consequences they had so eagerly and carefully arranged for me. The rotten branches of my family tree had been cut away without hesitation. Because of that painful, necessary severance, the roots of my life were finally free to heal. The billion-dollar fortune Garrett had tried so desperately to steal was now functioning as an impenetrable shield for thousands of forgotten people who had no one else willing to fight for them. Conrad walked over and stood quietly beside me, both of us looking out at the dissolving golden light. He had been my sharpest instrument and my most trusted ally through the darkest passages of this war. He reached into his canvas briefcase and drew out a single clean sheet of paper, setting it with care on the edge of the polished walnut desk. He looked at me with quiet professional respect and asked whether I had reached my final decision regarding the board of directors, whether I was ready to sign the official corporate documents and step down fully as active chief executive of my biotechnology empire. I turned from the glass and looked down at the single dotted line waiting for my name. I had spent my entire adult life building, accumulating, and scrapping for survival in a punishing corporate world. I had cured physical disease in the laboratory. I had cut the toxic parasites from my own bloodline. I had cemented my legacy and set my grandson on a path toward an honest, self-determined future. There were no battles left to fight and no more empires left to build. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket, withdrew my brass pen, and pressed its tip firmly to the paper. I signed with a single smooth, unbroken stroke and felt a quiet, profound sense of closure move through the room. I slid the brass pen back into my pocket and looked over at Conrad. I told him the paperwork was done, the transfer of power was complete. I buttoned my jacket and took in the horizon one final time, I told him I had spent 74 years surviving, working, and fighting to protect my legacy from thieves in expensive suits. I smiled a calm, genuine smile and told him the time had come to finally truly live. The soft, rhythmic clicking of my fishing reel was the only sound disturbing the stillness of the late afternoon. I sat in a weathered wooden chair at the edge of a quiet, secluded lake, miles removed from the glass towers and relentless noise of the city. The setting sun laid a long copper warmth across the surface of the water, catching the gentle ripples and lighting up my face. I could feel the deep lines around my eyes, but for the first time in a decade and a half, those lines weren't carved by chronic stress or suffocating grief. They rested in absolute profound peace. My phone lay on the wooden dock beside my tackle box, dark and completely silent. No frantic buzzing notifications. No panicked voicemails from a son pleading for a $2 million lifeline to keep himself out of federal prison. No hollow manufactured lies dressed up in the disguise of family love. The toxic, deafening noise that had crashed through my life had been permanently and ruthlessly silenced. The air out here was crisp and clean, untainted by the desperate hunger of a man who had seen his own father as nothing more than an expiring bank account. I cast my line out into the deep water and watched the small orange bobber settle softly on the glassy surface. I drew a slow breath and thought about the vast, almost unimaginable distance between the man I was and the man I am now. 15 years ago, I was a discarded, broken shell of a human being standing on a cold, concrete driveway. A grieving widower who had been tossed aside like a bag of worthless garbage, expected to fade quietly into the shadows and disappear. My son and his wife mistook my silence for total submission. They read my shattered heart as terminal weakness. They forgot one fundamental truth about the man who had built everything they tried to take. I do not lie down and surrender. I didn't just survive the cruel, twisted game they forced on me. I dismantled it completely. I bought the board, I changed the pieces, and I rewrote every rule of their pathetic, parasitic existence. I took the worst betrayal a parent can endure and forged it into an impenetrable financial shield for thousands of people who had been left behind. I didn't pursue a loud or violent revenge. I simply held up a mirror and let their own staggering greed consume them whole. My grandson Cody is currently sitting at a modest metal desk downtown, drawing an honest standard hourly wage. He pays his own rent every month, manages his own budget, and is building a future on nothing but genuine hard work. He comes to see me on weekends not to ask for a cash allowance, but to sit on this very dock and talk with me about his classes, his daily struggles, and his real victories. He broke the generational curse of entitlement, and he did it because I flatly refused to hand him an easy, unearned way out. I lost a son to the terminal poison of greed, but I pulled my grandson back by offering him the harsh, unyielding cure of reality. I reeled the line and slowly feeling the satisfying mechanical resistance of the gears turning. Far from this peaceful lake in the heart of the financial district stands the grand marble lobby of my foundation. Thousands of people pass through those heavy glass doors every single day, seeking refuge from the exact same financial abuse I once suffered. They arrive shattered and frightened, and they leave with an army of relentless corporate attorneys at their backs. Right at the center of that vast lobby, set on a polished black granite pedestal, sits a small reinforced glass display case. Inside that carefully lit case rests a crumpled $100 bill, a single $50 bill, and a faded yellow piece of paper. The hurried, blunt handwriting is still perfectly legible. You will figure it out. That piece of paper no longer sits tucked away in my private study. It belongs to the world now. It stands as a permanent immortal monument to every greedy, entitled child who believes they can plunder the parents who gave them life and simply walk away untouched. It stands as a silent guardian for the elderly, reminding them that they are not obligated to absorb abuse from the people who share their blood. I looked out across the quiet, secluded lake as the sun dropped below the dark tree line, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and blue. A cool evening breeze moved across my face, carrying the scent of pine and something that felt like absolute freedom. I leaned back in my wooden chair, completely unburdened by the shadows of everything behind me. Let that small yellow piece of paper serve as a final definitive warning to anyone who looks at a quiet old man and sees an easy mark. The silence of a betrayed father or a discarded grandfather is never surrender. It is never a concession of weakness or an acceptance of what was done to him. It is simply the deep measured calm before the storm breaks. It is the quiet, deliberate preparation before the natural order reasserts itself once and for all. The most important truth I took from all of this is that blood does not entitle anyone to a permanent license to disrespect or exploit you. Family is meant to be a foundation of genuine support, not a breeding ground for entitlement and corrosive betrayal. When people reveal their true nature by discarding you at your lowest moment, you must find the courage to believe exactly what they are showing you. If you've stayed with me this far, then you already understand what this story is really about. It isn't about billions of dollars or courtrooms or federal sentences. It's about a man who was left on a cold driveway with $150 and a cruel note and who refused to disappear. What it cost me was 15 years. 15 years of starting over, of silence, of carrying a grief that most people will never have to know. But I believe God doesn't waste suffering. The very wound they thought would finish me became the foundation that protected thousands of others. That is not luck. That is something far larger than any of us. If these grandpa revenge stories remind you of someone you love, a father, a grandfather, an elder who was underestimated, then hold on to these lessons because they are hard-won. First, silence is not weakness. A quiet man building in the background is the most dangerous force in any room. Second, the sharpest response to betrayal is not anger, it is accountability. Let the consequences speak for you. Third, blood does not earn trust. Trust is built by choices, and it can be taken back when those choices are cruel. Fourth, if someone discards you at your lowest, believe them. Then get up, get to work, and outlast them. These are the father stories that don't make the front page, the ones where the man who was written off writes the final chapter himself. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge. There are more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them was earned. Thank you for listening. Take care of the people who took care of you, and I'll see you in the next one.